Russell W. Lee was the most prolific of many fine photographers who documented America between 1936 and 1942 for the Farm Security Administration, a New Deal program of assistance for poor and destitute farmers and rural inhabitants during the Great Depression and Dust Bowl era. When asked why he wanted to take people's pictures, Russ replied, "Why do I want to take your picture? In part for this, that you value your picture of your mother and your father, and that is of a certain period. I want to take your picture because that's going to be of a certain period too. It's going to be of today, which is going to be tomorrow's history."
So this is the second half. I am delighted to introduce our two presenters this evening, and we're going to go in alphabetical order. So we'll start with Jim Bones. Acclaimed landscape photographer Jim Bones knows the strength and splendor of nature's world and captures her intimate beauty at its finest. His attention to light, color, and detail distinguishes his art. Bones received formal education at the University of Texas and practical instruction working in the field. He studied and worked with two exceptional American photographers, Russell Lee, a master of large format black and white photography, and Elliot Porter, world-renowned for his color nature photography. Our second presenter, you all know, Lonn Taylor, is a historian and writer who retired to Fort Davis, thank goodness for us, with his wife Dee Double, after 20 years as a historian at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. He grew up in the Philippine Islands, finished high school in Fort Worth, received a BA in History and Government from Texas Christian University in 1961, and did graduate work as a Woodrow Wilson Fellow at New York University before returning to Texas to enter the museum field. So I am delighted to present these two gentlemen who have a long...
There's one more thing.
One more thing, yes.
He climbed to the top of the Rio Grande watershed, 12,000 feet from Beartown, all above tree line. This was an epiphany.
Lonn Taylor.
Mm-hmm. Changed his life.
Changed his life.
And I was happy to be there.
And you were there.
It did.
So not only do these two have a friendship, they were also friends with Russell Lee. And so I've prepared for these gentlemen 7 questions. And we will start off with the first one, and I'm going to tap Lonn. My first question for both gentlemen is, how did you first meet Russell Lee?
Well, I first met Russ through politics, and I had no idea that he was a famous photographer. I moved into a new neighborhood in Austin in the summer of 1968, and I volunteered to be a Democratic poll watcher in the November elections. And Russ and I worked the same ballot box and stayed up until about 2 in the morning helping to count ballots, because we had paper ballots back then. And Russ then invited all of the Democrats to his house for a post-election drink and to listen to the returns. And we just hit it off. As they said time and time again in the film, Russ had an incredible capacity for friendship. Mm-hmm. But it was, I guess, 6 months or a year before I found out he had been an FSA photographer, because he was also an extremely modest man.
Jim, how did you first meet Russell Lee?
Well, in 1965, I was a geology major, and I had a student assistant job in a darkroom working for an electron microscope lab. And my job was to experimentally print glass negatives. And at that time, in the art department during the summer, there was a little gallery available for non-art majors. And I showed the people in the office what I had, photograms and some prints and so forth I had made and printed in that darkroom. And they gave me a show. And when I was putting up the show, this really wonderful-looking gentleman with this great smile and these eyes that just penetrated came in and looked around the room while I was hanging the show. And after a while, he came up and said, talk to me a little about what you've done here. And I explained the situation, that I was a geology major and having the show. And he said, well, I'm going to be teaching photography starting in the fall, and I need an assistant. Would you like to be it? We'd never met. I said, I'm a geology major. He said, it doesn't matter. I like what you see. I like what I see here, what you've been doing. And so I said, let me talk to the people in the geology department. And they were really understanding, and I made a commitment to them that I wouldn't forget about them. And so I went over to the art department and was his teaching assistant for the first 2 years. After the first year, Jimmy Jalapeno, that's his painting name, was his painting name, came on because we had so many students. Jim Bonner was his real name. And for those first 2 years, Russ would teach us what we were going to teach the students the day before. So we would act like we knew what we were doing. And he was just the most wonderful mentor and instructor. And I don't believe I ever heard him raise his voice, although he could be so stern in his silence that you knew you had displeased him. But he had a way of eliciting the best in every student without putting anyone down, which was not very typical of the art department at that time. There were a lot of large egos throwing themselves around, and he was quite different.
Well, and it's kind of interesting what both you and Lonn are saying about Russell Lee, and so it kind of segues into the next question, and you might already have answered it, and I'll start with Jim. What were your immediate impressions of Russell Lee?
The most honest man I think I've ever met. And very compassionate. He tried to understand if students were having problems, what they were, and to help them with that. During the critiques, which were held once a week, we would all assemble in a room. He had a big overhead projector because we used prints at that time, and I was the one doing that. I'd put it on the projector on the wall. There would be a little time of silence, 2 or 3 minutes. People would look at it, and then he would say, so what was it about this that interested you? And the student would kind of wander around, and Russ had these 2 big right-angle things made out of masonite that he would whap up on the wall and start cropping down. He said, well, this, and the student would say something like, well, if I, was that fly up in the upper left corner. And he would zoom in on it and say, get in closer. Go back, make more pictures. He kept telling us, get in closer, make more pictures.
How about for you, Lonn?
Well, I thought he was just one of the nicest people I had ever met. And any number of people in that film talked about his beautiful smile. Mm-hmm. And I know that is why he was such a successful photographer. People just were drawn to him instantly. Years later, after we first met, I worked with him on a photographic exhibit that unfortunately never came to fruition. But he told me that when he was working in St. Augustine, you all remember that picture of the courthouse square with all the people? And he said when he was out there with his camera on the square, an old farmer came up to him and said, what are you doing? And Russ said, well, I'm a photographer. And this fellow looked at him for a minute and he said, well, I don't have enough money to have my picture made, but I'd like to give you a quarter.
And you a while back had written a really lovely article about Russell Lee, and you kind of focused on that time that he was in St. Augustine. If I remember correctly, he had originally gone there to look at the eradication of screwworm.
That's right.
And when he got there, the public health official, it was kind of, no, we don't want to talk about that. So he and Jean were there. And this is when they were talking about he was basically a taxonomist, because if I remember correctly in your article, he spent all that time in St. Augustine looking at how, what people did and where they worked. And the time that he spent at the courthouse and on the square. And so he just went through and photo documented everything that was happening while he was there. Well,
he told me that the initial attraction to him and Jean was that there was a hotel there that had wonderful food. And they'd been traveling, going from place to place every day and kind of living out of their car. Mm-hmm. And they just moved into that hotel for, I think, 10 days. And he made that wonderful series of photographs, and in a way that was kind of a forerunner to his Pie Town series because he did the same thing in Pytown.
Right, because they also reference back the same sort of taxonomy that he did in Pytown as well. So you had mentioned you had worked with him on a photo show?
Well, that's when I was a curator of history at the Dallas Historical Society. I think it was in 1978. I knew that Russ had made this 18-month tour of Texas from things he'd told me earlier. And so I proposed an exhibit of his Texas photographs to the director of the society, who was John Crane, who I think you probably know. And John and I thought it was a great idea. And so I went to Washington with Russ to the Library of Congress to pick the prints that we would make the cut from, and got to go through those wonderful files they showed in the film at the library with Russ. And we picked about 300 prints. And the thing that impressed me about working with him on that show was that he said he definitely did not want any of his prints exhibited singly as works of art. And he talked at some length about how his photography was a story, and he worked in series, and so we picked a bunch of series of prints for that show. And unfortunately, the show never came off, because when John proposed the idea to the chairman of the board of the Dallas Historical Society, who was Joe Dealey, Joe Dealey said, "Oh no, people in Dallas don't want to see pictures of poor people and Mexicans and blacks." And he was right. People in Dallas then didn't want to see those kind of pictures. So the show never came off, but it was a great pleasure to work with him.
Oh, I can. Well, he had over 19,000 images from Russell Lee did. He was the most prolific.
Yeah, something like that. I don't know the exact figure. But
there's a great little website, Photogrammer, Photogramma. Go to that, and it has all the FSA photographers, and click on Russell Lee, and it has a map, and you can see the territory. It is
Oh yeah,
it's unreal.
Yeah.
The time he spent out on the road.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Well, how about you, Jim? Did you ever work on a project with Russell Lee?
Oh yeah, quite a few. But
one of
the things that he kept emphasizing was that the story's in the details. You know, now the deal is the one big smashing picture, often with the photographer's ego in front of the person in the picture. And you will notice in Russ's pictures, he's there, but he's not insinuating himself. He used to say, if you're honest and you pay attention, your character will come through, your personality will come through, and you won't have to exaggerate it. And all of the students that I knew that came through developed that attitude, and nobody was grandstanding. That was quite something.
And I think it also goes back to the quote about the gesture.
Oh, he was really big into gestures. Oh, yeah. He said, look at the hands, look at what the feet are doing, look at the eyes, look at what people have put down, how they put it down on the desk. Mm-hmm. But you saw all of those interiors from the Depression. I mean, that was really personal. People really trusted him.
To let someone come inside your house, I think, for anyone, any of us.
And he did it with such honor to the people. That was,
you know, when I was working on that project with him, I took the St. Augustine pictures we had picked to St. Augustine, because I had cousins in St. Augustine, and I showed the pictures to my cousin Knight Parker, who is the man in that photograph of the general store with all that stuff hanging from the. Yeah. There's a man behind the counter that you can barely see in that picture because there's so much stuff around him. But that's Mr. Knight. And so Knight called a bunch of his friends, all people his age, over to the store. And we went through those photographs. And there was one of an elderly man with a huge walrus mustache. And he's standing with his hands out like this. And when I put that picture on the table, everybody in the room caught their breath, and Mr. Knight said, "That's old man Holloway." And he held his hands out like this. And he says, "I can see him like he was standing in front of this counter." And Knight kept moving his hands up and down. That was evidently a characteristic gesture of this old gentleman.
Lonn, how did knowing Russell Lee influence your work and outlook on the human condition?
Well, Russ said one thing to me that I've never forgotten, and as a historian was extremely important to me. He said that the purpose of the FSA, of his work and all the people who worked with him, was to show people in cities how people in rural areas lived. And he said the photograph was the most powerful medium of communication. He said you would not believe in the 1930s what a division there was between urban areas and the countryside. And people in the urban East had no conception of how people in the rural South or the rural West or the rural Midwest lived. And I'm of the generation that grew up with Life magazine and just took it for granted, that everybody knew about photographs and everybody saw photographs all the time. And I realized that in the mid-30s that wasn't the case.
How about for you, Jim? How did knowing him influence your work and outlook on the human condition?
Oh, in every way you could imagine. I was really interested in black and white photography and people and all of that when I started working with him, and I became more and more interested in the natural environment, since all the rest of it depends on that. And I had long discussions with he and Gene about was it a sellout to take pictures of nature when the human condition was so bad? And Russ said no, that it wasn't, that the land was part of our culture, part of everything, and that people needed to know what it was that sustained us. And at one point, he actually recommended that I start working in color. He came running into the darkroom one day with this book, which is by Elliott Porter. It's about Glen Canyon, the place that got flooded. And he said, look at this, all of you come look at this. I've never seen color work like this. And he went through page by page with us. And he was so excited. He said, this is beautiful. This is what is needed. The same kind of thing that was done for people that needs to be done for the land. And it changed my direction entirely at that point. He was actually a master color photographer. People don't know that film talks a little about his
the work he did in Pytown.
Yeah, that was some of the beginning of color Kodachrome. Years later, Amon Carter had me print some of his early color work, and I have some of those here. These are dye transfer prints from his work for Standard Oil, and you're welcome to come have a look at these. But when I got interested in color, he brought out all of this stuff, filters and colorimeters and all of this other material, and said, I will help you any way I can. And so I began to develop into a color photographer of landscape. And he encouraged all of this. And at the end of my stay at Paisano, J. Frank Dobie's ranch for that fellowship, he came out one evening and helped me select all the pictures that went into the book, Texas Heartland to Hill Country.
Oh, wow.
Jim, did he do dye transfer printing himself?
No, he never did. But he was alive when I did these, and so I took them to Austin. We went over them. He made all the comments about how to change them. And so I made two sets of prints, one that went to the Amon Carter Museum and one that went to somebody at Texas Monthly. I don't know.
We're still there.
Right.
In someone's office.
In someone's office, right.
Well, in the film, there was a lot of time spent talking about Russell Lee and Gene and fishing. And it seemed like that was a very important way for them. It just sounded incredible, their life on the road and what they did and to get away and what the good friend would go to visit him up at Lake Buchanan.
Uh-huh.
It was months and weeks. So my question, and I'll start with Jimmy, is did you ever go fishing with him? And or can you recall one of his fishing stories?
Yes, I did actually have the pleasure of going fishing with him, along with two other of his students, Rick Frederick and Stan Curl. And we went out with him one day, Highway 71 to where it crosses the Pedernales. And there was a boat ramp you could pull down on the kind of the northwest side of the river there. And we put in the boat, we went out, we had a little beer, always had a little beer. And we were fishing along, we were spinning. We weren't fly fishing like you saw in the movie, because we were fishing for bass. And we were doing all right. We caught 3 or 4 of them. We were having a pretty good time. You know, the beers were running low. And another boat full of fishermen came up and wanted to know how we were doing. And I started to reach down and pull up the fish string. And he put his hand on my hand and pushed it back down in the water. And he whispered, "Don't give it away." And then he said, "Oh, well, they're biting, but..."
Go someplace else.
That was pretty
I can tell you a story about one of his fishing trips. As the film said, he used to go to Lake City, Colorado all the time. And I have a friend who is a professor of anthropology at Colorado College in Colorado Springs. And her daughter, Moana Stoller, used to work as a waitress in the cafe in Lake City. And I asked Moana one time if she had ever met Russell Lee. And she thought about it and she said, Russ Lee. The smile! The man with the beautiful smile! She says, he loved biscuits. And she had never actually spoken to him. But she remembered him and somebody had told her who he was. And she remembered that smile.
Oh my. Wrapping this up in a way, what do you feel is Lee's lasting contributions to not only photography, but telling the story of the everyday man?
Oh, I think it's incalculable. Mm-hmm. I think he was probably the greatest documentary photographer of the 20th century. I mean, as you said to me earlier, he made 19,000 prints that are in the Library of Congress, and they record every aspect of everyday life. I want to add something about, I don't know exactly how to put this. I think maybe his greatest contribution was honesty. And I want to tell a little story about that. Do you all remember the photograph in the San Augustine sequence of the men sitting in the courtroom? There's a photograph that he took at a meeting that was called to discuss, I think it was seeking aid to build rural roads. And it's in the county courthouse, in the courtroom, and it's shot from the judge's seat. So you're looking at a crowd of people all sitting down. They're all white. The county commissioners are on the front row. They're older men. One of them's got his legs crossed. But that was part of a series of pictures that Russ took. And all the other photographs show the whole courtroom, which had a balcony, which is full of black people. Because, of course, everything was segregated in St. Augustine in 1940. And the Office of War Information during World War II selected that picture that we saw to be distributed all over Europe as an example of American democracy. And Russ was absolutely furious that they took that single shot out of the whole series that he shot. Because the series, of course, would have revealed that all public meetings in the South at that time were segregated.
Wow. And you, Jim?
Well, in addition to that,
Yes.
which is really
Yes.
primary. I think that one of his most lasting contributions was through his students. He had students from all areas. It was not his intention to train photographers when he started teaching. His intention was to give artists a tool. You remember he said he couldn't draw. And the photography would have enabled him to do that had he wanted to go on to do that. So he had students who ended up being museum directors, filmmakers, educators, librarians, general artists, and bookkeepers and people of all walks of life, but they all carried away that incredible sense of compassion for humanity. And one of his guiding principles for the students was, if you're going to do this for a living, you need to learn to photograph even things you don't like with compassion. He said, I don't care if you hate it. Go out there and photograph it and find out why it is that you don't, and find some point of communication with these people. He's speaking mostly of people, because they deserve it. They deserve your respect. So I think the people that came through and were touched by him have carried that to anyone they taught or anyone they met. It just, he had this ability to make people resonate in the best way possible. And are we near done?
Except for the bonus question.
Oh, okay. Well,
This is the bonus question.
okay.
Because I asked my two presenters, is there a question that you wish to be asked that I have not covered? And so here's the bonus question. And since poor Lonn Taylor doesn't know what the bonus question is, we're going to start with Jim. Opening those files because it's in there. Here's the bonus question. What was Russ like off duty when he was not being a teacher or photographer? So, Jim, you may start.
Okay, I'll have to set a scene here. And Lonn will remember this, that they had a huge wisteria vine in the backyard. And they had a wonderful big table out there, and it just formed this canopy. And in the springtime, the smell was wonderful. It seemed like always this 15-gallon bottle of Chianti wine on the table, right, and glasses all around. It was a place where people could come together and solve the world's problems with humor and have a good time. In one of these meetings, gatherings they were, we were talking about what might have happened, in different people's lives, and I asked Russ, what would you like to have been if you hadn't turned out to be a photographer? And he thought for a minute, and he said, a vaudeville song and dance man. And he jumped up from the table. We'd had a lot of wine, okay? He jumped up from the table. He ran upstairs. He came back down with a guitar and no shirt on. And he began to sing bawdy ballads.
I love it.
It was a great night.
I love it.
Well, Mom, I don't know if you've ever experienced that off duty.
Well, he was delightfully uninhibited. When we were in Washington together, we were going up to the Library of Congress one morning, and we were at the DuPont Circle subway stop. And that stop has a very long escalator. It's the second longest in the D.C. metro system. It goes down probably, what do you think, Dee Dee, 200 feet? Yeah. And it starts above the surface, of course. And there's this huge tunnel that it descends into with a big arched entrance. And so Russ and I were on that escalator, and it was rush hour, we were surrounded by serious bureaucrats going to work. And when we started into that tunnel, Russ threw up his arms and shouted, "Into the mouth of hell!"
Well, that concludes my interrogation of you two. Oh, yes? Do you have something?
I have one other thing, which
Okay.
is one of those remarkable things. How do you explain it? But Russ died in August 1986. after, I think, a kind of a long illness. But he was really pretty strong up to the end. But I had been in southwestern Colorado in the San Juan Mountains taking pictures that August, and I had just come through Lake City, and I had come up on Slumgullion Pass on the way to Creed, and I wanted a weather report because it had been raining a lot, and I turned on the radio, and I heard, yesterday Russell Lee, famous photographer, died in Austin, Texas. And then there was no more radio.
Whoa!
I went back down in the.
Oh, you'd gone in.
Yeah, and that was the one and only moment I could have gotten that broadcast.
That's amazing.
It really was. And if there weren't two other people in the car at the time, I wouldn't tell that story. But he really profoundly changed my life. As Tom Livesey, another of his students who became a famous museum curator, said, if it hadn't been for us, both Tom and I would have ended up as some kind of petty conman. So we have Russ to thank for that. Thank you all so much for coming.
Well, I want to thank both of you gentlemen for coming out this evening.
Mary, I want to thank you for showing that film, because when I learned that there was going to be an hour-long film before our program, I admit my heart sort of fell. But that film brought back so many people that I knew.
Yes.
Conrad and Creek Fath, Alan Fern, J.D. Colson, who I hadn't thought about in years. It was wonderfully rejuvenating.
Yeah, it was like a nice homecoming, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. It was.
When you guys go through the show, J.B. Colson printed all of the prints that are featured in this exhibit. Lovely.
Well, I just want to reiterate again, thank you all so much for joining us tonight, and I also want to thank Mary Bones for her tremendous work.